The most ancient king list known to humanity doesn't start with a ruler who is human. It starts with something completely different. Figures who ruled for tens of thousands of years in cities constructed before history had truly begun. This evening, we're posing a question that academics seldom express openly. What if the initial kings weren't human whatsoever? Before you get settled, pause for a second to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you truly see worth in these profound dives into old documents. Share in the comments the location you're viewing from and what specifically attracts you to Sumerian history. It's intriguing how individuals around the world, divided by thousands of miles in various time zones, end up drawn to identical ancient inquiries about power, validity, and the beginnings of governance. Now, lower the lights, make yourself cozy, and let's proceed cautiously into what the first literate society really documented regarding authority itself. We're not present to conjecture about extraterrestrial visitors or concealed inventions. We're not forcing contemporary ideas onto cuneiform inscriptions. We're engaging in something more disturbing. Examining what the Sumerians themselves inscribed about monarchy, regarding their cosmological assertions earnestly as factual declarations, and questioning what perspective would generate such documents initially. The Sumerian King List survives in several versions kept in various cities and across multiple eras. Scribes in Nippur, Larsa, and Babylon, divided by centuries, replicated the same core structure. Kingship came down from the heavens, first established in the city of Eridu, and managed by leaders whose terms extended over implausible durations. This isn't mythology in a superficial way. This is official governmental record-keeping. The king lists acted as the core document for royal authenticity throughout Mesopotamian chronicles. When subsequent monarchs sought to validate their entitlement to power, they linked their assertions to this lineage, this continuous sequence of command extending back prior to the deluge. The record was functional, administrative, vital, and it commences by declaring that governance itself arose from a source beyond human creation. Think about what that implies. Every current political framework, whether democracy, monarchy, theocracy, or dictatorship, presumes that rule arises from human communities. We argue over how leaders ought to be selected, who merits authority, what boundaries should restrict power. But we hold a basic premise. Political structures are human inventions, created and upheld by individuals. The Sumerians noted something else. Per their most ancient and authoritative governmental text, kingship predated the complete formation of human society. It arrived as a fully formed system, not pieced together through experimentation and mistakes, not evolved slowly via societal development, but conveyed intact from the godly domain to the world. The initial city to obtain this conveyed power was Eridu, situated in the southernmost parts of ancient Sumer, close to what was at that time the Persian Gulf's shore. Archaeological digs have verified that Eridu is one of the most ancient continually occupied locations in Mesopotamia, with shrine buildings tracing back to at least 5,400 BC. The city was associated with Enki, deity of fresh waters, knowledge, and primeval sorcery. Enki's shrine compound, the Absu, was positioned atop the subterranean sweet-water sea that the Sumerians thought nourished all existence. In their worldview, Eridu wasn't merely ancient, it was primary. The spot where society itself originated, where heavenly structure contacted the ground, where the line between universal and earthly truth was most fragile. And this is the place where kingship arrived upon descending from the heavens. The king list identifies the first leader as Alulim, who administered Eridu for 28,800 years. The next king, Al-Algar, governed the same location for 36,000 years. The third, Enmenluana, maintained control in Bad Tibira for 43,200 years. These figures show up reliably in all extant versions of the document. They aren't copying mistakes. They aren't subsequent amplifications. The scribal custom safeguarded them with identical precision afforded to verifiable dynasties whose term durations we can confirm via archaeological proof. Academics have suggested various interpretations. The figures could signify lineages instead of single persons, or encode celestial patterns, or indicate a distinct idea of time prior to uniform calendars, or represent legendary periods separate from factual timelines. All such explanations recognize the same basic truth. The earliest Mesopotamian governmental custom did not view the initial holders of kingship as regular human sovereigns. Something regarding these entities, their essence, their role, their connection to time as such, was fundamentally distinct from the monarchs who followed the deluge. The pre-flood leaders oversaw a world that the Sumerians repeatedly portrayed as incomplete. Creation had taken place, certainly, but existence was still firming up, still establishing the models that would ultimately regulate historical durations. Heaven and earth had been divided, forcibly split by the deity Enlil per the cosmological writings. But the split was fresh, still penetrable. In this interim age, kingship operated not as governmental management, but as universal upkeep. The earliest sovereigns interceded between godly purpose and worldly being, upholding structure in a existence not yet entirely secured, ruling over a humankind not yet completely detached from the heavenly designs that formed creation. This explains why their terms are counted in tens of thousands of years. Not due to individual people surviving that long, but because the position they represented functioned under alternate temporal guidelines. The guidelines of legendary time, universal time, holy time, that comes before the historical timeline we acknowledge. 5 cities obtained kingship prior to the deluge: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city possessed a sponsoring god. Each city fulfilled particular universal roles. Each king managed heavenly structure on the god's behalf, preserving the delicate equilibrium between heaven and earth. Then the Sumerian King List presents one of the most crushing phrases in old writings. Then the flood swept over. No rationale, no alert, no religious defense, just a stark declaration of disastrous shift. All that preceded, the unbelievably extended terms, the pre-flood cities, the leaders who represented kingship instead of just possessing it, concluded. When kingship reappeared following the water's retreat, it reappeared altered, reduced, finite. The post-deluge lineages in Kish, Uruk, and Ur still governed by godly command, still asserted descent from deities, still carried out identical ceremonies of holy monarchy. But their terms now spanned decades, not thousands of years. They perished. They were deposed. They vied for assets, waged conflicts, erected structures to bolster unstable validity. Kingship endured the deluge, but something core about its character did not. The Sumerians aimed to safeguard a recollection, not of ancient extraterrestrials or sophisticated devices, but of an era when command itself followed alternate guidelines, when authority was handled by entities adapted to an existence humans could no longer reach. This poses a query that will direct our whole investigation this evening. If kingship needed to descend from the heavens, since it couldn't arise on earth, what rendered the first sovereigns suitable to accept it? The clay artifact called the Weld Blundell Prism resides in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum. Inscribed around 270 BC during Utu-Hegel's rule in Uruk. It remains the most intact extant version of the Sumerian King List. Its uniform markings span all 4 faces in orderly columns, cataloging every lineage that governed Mesopotamia from time's start to the scribes' era. The prism is compact, merely 8 inches high, but its contents are immense because this isn't just a log of kings. It's a religious assertion about authority's essence itself, masked as administrative documentation. The initial lines, pressed into clay almost 4,200 years past, issue a declaration that ought to halt us abruptly. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king and reigned 28,800 years. Observe the wording precisely. Kingship was lowered, not evolved, not devised by astute humans arranging into intricate groups, not steadily constructed via assemblies, pacts, or martial triumphs. Lowered. The Sumerian term is mi-anigar, which expresses the tangible act of placing something down from above. The identical verb shows in shrine-building texts depicting how godly statues are lowered into their sanctuaries, how holy items are set with ceremonial accuracy. This isn't symbolism. This isn't artistic phrasing intended to render ordinary political changes sound grand. This is universal mechanics, a depiction of how heavenly systems shift into the worldly domain. Every society crafts origin legends to justify its communal frameworks. The Romans linked their command back to Aeneas escaping Troy, tying themselves to godly heritage via Venus. Chinese emperors asserted heaven's mandate, situating themselves as intermediaries between universal harmony and earthly disorder. Medieval European monarchs demanded divine privilege, contending that God individually approved their governance. But the Sumerians did something distinct. They didn't assert that their kings were selected by deities, or graced with heavenly favor, or stemmed from eternal lineages. They asserted that the system of kingship itself, the whole mechanism of centralized command, originated outside the human domain and was implanted intact into cities that already comprehended they were meant to fulfill universal aims. This difference is deeply significant. Modern political thought from Aristotle via Hobbes to present democratic concepts views governance as a remedy to human issues. People require coordination, safeguarding, asset allocation, dispute settlement. So they create systems, clans, chiefdoms, nations, empires that focus decision-making authority in manners that ideally aid the group. The Sumerians recorded the reverse order. Per their official documents, kingship emerged before the issues it allegedly addressed. It descended into Eridu, not because humans required rule, but because deities decided that governance must be present on Earth, managed through particular cities by specific entities able to uphold universal harmony in physical shape. Eridu wasn't selected as the primary city due to economic advantage or defensive strength or farming output. It was primary because it held a singular universal spot, the location where Enki's realm, the Absu, met the surface realm. The Absu wasn't merely subsurface water. In Sumerian doctrine, it symbolized the origin of all possibility, all insight, all inventive sorcery. Enki, residing in the Absu under Eridu, controlled the Mi, the essential edicts of existence, the heavenly directives that dictated how all from kingship to bread production to intimate relations would operate. When kingship descended, it landed where existence's bases were most reachable, where godly designs could most readily shift into human oversight. The King List safeguards another vital element that most renderings hide. The verb forms for pre-flood kings vary from those for post-deluge lineages. The earliest sovereigns are depicted with a grammatical structure indicating finished, flawless, perpetually legitimate deeds. Subsequent kings employ regular past tense, identifying them as factual persons whose terms concluded and were followed by others. This grammatical alteration corresponds to a universal shift. The pre-deluge era wasn't just extremely old history. It was a categorically separate duration, functioning under separate guidelines, ruled by separate kinds of entities. Alulim's 28,800-year term isn't a muddled recollection of a lengthy lineage or a wrongly computed timeline. It's a declaration about authority's character in legendary time when kingship served not as political oversight, but as universal fixation, securing existence itself in correct shape. Reflect on what this signifies for how the Sumerians grasped their own being. When they gazed back at their beginnings, they perceived not human cleverness steadily constructing society from dispersed hamlets, but heavenly design purposefully placing systems that would preserve harmony once creation firmed. Cities arose first, then the human groups to fill them. Kingship arose first, then the sovereigns appropriate to represent it. Framework preceded residence. This reverses every presumption we hold about cultural progression. We envision early humans fighting to endure, gradually advancing farming, creating communities, ultimately concentrating authority. A movement from basic to intricate, from dispersed to structured, from innate to contrived. The Sumerians noted the contrary. Descending harmony, cities established by deities, kingship handled by entities who dwelled at the border between godly and human domains, securing existence during the susceptible period when creation was new and unsecured. The King List identifies 8 kings before the deluge, governing across 5 cities over a total 241,200 years. Each term was quantified, each change catalogued. Each king accepted kingship from his forerunner in a continuous chain, extending back to that initial instant in Eridu when heavenly command touched the ground. Then the flood swept over, and that chain preserved across an age longer than all documented human history broke. But here's what the text compels us to face. If kingship descended because humans weren't prepared to form it themselves, if it demanded entities able to withstand legendary time to uphold it, if the first sovereigns were essentially different from the mortal lineages that followed, then what precisely were the pre-flood kings? Not entirely human per their own society's most holy governmental records. Not deities because deities don't perish in floods. Something intermediate, something interim, something adapted to a world we no longer dwell in. The Eridu Genesis, written around 1600 BC but safeguarding much older spoken customs, portrays creation not as a lone finished deed, but as a continuing procedure, existence appearing in phases. Each stage constructing on the prior, none of them completely steady. The tablet was dug from Nippur in broken state, its borders eroded. Entire parts vanished to time. But what endures informs us something essential. The Sumerians comprehended the world their earliest kings ruled as basically unfinished. The text starts with a notable picture. Before cities, before shrines, before even the designations of items had been set, there was only Namu, the primeval ocean, the undifferentiated possibility from which all would ultimately arise. Namu wasn't a goddess who formed. She was formation itself in its pre-expressed condition, pure potential, holding all future shapes, but manifesting none. The cosmic waters that predated existence having categories. From Namu emerged the first separation, and signifying heaven, and Ki embodying earth. But these weren't the divided domains we know now. The creation texts are clear on this. An and Ki originally existed in unity. Heaven and earth compressed together in undivided completeness, creating what the texts term Anki, the cosmic mountain. No gap between sky and soil, no space for atmosphere, for climate, for the intermediate domain where human life would later develop. Just compacted possibility, awaiting the force that would pry it apart. That force arrived via Enlil, whose name signifies Lord Air or Lord Storm. The legends describe him pushing his way between his parents, and above and Kai below, literally ripping heaven from earth, forming the air, setting the basic division that renders earthly existence feasible. But here's what counts for grasping pre-flood kingship. This division was recent. The legends don't portray it as primordial, ancient past recall. They portray it as the foundational deed that initiated the present universal harmony. The instant when existence as we recognize it began shaping. All that occurred before Enlil's division exists in legendary time. The eternal now of godly action. All after exists in the time heading toward history. The pre-flood kings governed during this change. They ruled in the wake of division, but before firming, overseeing cities on an earth still echoing from universal injury, preserving harmony, while the borders between godly and mortal domains were still establishing into lasting shape. The Sumerian creation legend, another broken text from Nippur, safeguards a detail most translations overlook. After dividing heaven from earth, Enlil needed to continually strengthen the split, stopping them from falling back into unity. The division wasn't automatic or lasting. It demanded upkeep. This isn't secondary mythology. This is universal mechanics with immediate governmental consequences. If existence itself demanded active upkeep, if the fundamental framework of being was unsteady and required godly supervision to avert universal breakdown, then kingship in this era couldn't conceivably operate as mere human rule. The sovereigns had to be capable of joining in universal firming, securing the divided domains apart via ceremonial deeds and holy oversight. Archaeological proof, curiously, backs the text's schedule in surprising manners. The Ubaid period, about 5,500 to 4,000 BC, indicates when the first lasting communities emerged in southern Mesopotamia, including the earliest building stages at Eridu. These communities display advanced planning from their start. Shrines constructed along exact alignments, ceremonial areas thoughtfully combined with residential zones, signs of centralized direction without evident signs of centralized forceful control. It's as if the cities understood their purpose before their populations fully formed the hierarchies to impose it. The shrines from this era are especially telling. At Eridu, the archaeological order shows 18 consecutive shrine structures built directly atop each other, each adhering to the same fundamental orientation and layout across nearly 2 millennia. Not development, not trial, repetition of a set holy design, upheld with remarkable uniformity across generations. Who upheld this design? Who guaranteed that each rebuild followed the model exactly even as centuries elapsed and groups shifted? The King List asserts rulers functioning under different temporal guidelines, entities for whom time itself progressed differently, authorities whose terms could cover the whole building order because they weren't restricted by human lifetimes. In Sumerian worldview, legendary time, Udba, in those days, functions by different mechanics than historical time. Events in legendary time don't advance straight from cause to result. They exist concurrently, eternally now, accessible for ceremonial reenactment. The deities don't grow old. Their deeds don't fade into past tense. They stay constantly reachable through appropriate ritual and calling. The pre-flood kings, per textual proof, joined both temporal structures at once. They existed in historical order, one king succeeding another, lineages following each other, cities ascending to importance then giving way to successors. But they also existed in legendary time, their terms overlapping with eternal godly designs, their command flowing straight from the instant kingship descended, their role preserving continuity between universal harmony and earthly oversight. This dual being explains why their term lengths challenge historical timelines. They weren't quantifying time as we do, noting days and years and decades until demise comes. They were quantifying stages of universal firming, noting ages where godly harmony needed different types of upkeep, documenting the gradual shift from newly divided existence toward the secured world where purely human sovereigns could ultimately assume control. The Sumerian perspective repeatedly stressed incompleteness. The cosmos wasn't formed perfect and complete. It was formed as possibility that required nurturing, framework that needed upkeep, harmony that could always fall back into disorder without proper supervision. The Enuma Elish, though Babylonian instead of Sumerian, safeguards this older Mesopotamian view. Creation doesn't conclude with the world's shaping. It concludes with the deities constructing shrines, setting worship, placing humans to uphold ritual duty. Existence firms only when the correct structures of command and service are operating properly. The pre-flood kings existed during existence's susceptible stage. After creation but before completion, after division but before firming, in a world where heaven and earth were separate but still permeable to one another, where godly design still directly affected earthly occurrences, where human community was arising but not yet independent. In such a world, rule couldn't be simply political. It had to be universal. Sovereigns had to mediate between domains that were still establishing into their ultimate setup, upholding harmony across borders that weren't yet secured, administering command that descended from the godly domain because nothing earthly yet existed that could produce it autonomously. The deluge would ultimately cut this link. The waters would seal the permeable border, force heaven and earth into lasting division. collapse legendary time into historical time, change kingship from universal role into human position. But before that disastrous shift, for 241,200 years per the King List's count, the pre-flood sovereigns secured existence stable while it learned to uphold itself. They weren't human monarchs who survived impossibly extended lives. They were interim authorities, essential links between universal source and historical being, entities adapted to a world that humans, as we comprehend humanity, weren't yet fully prepared to inherit. If the world itself was still firming, still establishing into the patterns we now assume, could its sovereigns have been entirely human at all? In 1923, a University of Pennsylvania dig at ancient Nippur revealed a damaged tablet labeled NI 3191, dating to roughly 2000 BC. It held another version of the Sumerian King List, but this edition included side notes added by a subsequent scribe, smaller script editions that disclosed something unanticipated. The scribe had been bothered by the figures, not bothered enough to alter them, not bothered enough to reject them as false, but bothered enough to insert short remarks noting that these term lengths were udly, days without measure. A term used elsewhere in Sumerian writings to describe mythological time, events happening in ages that don't align with human encounter. The scribe replicated the impossible figures loyally, then observed they pertained to a different temporal order, then proceeded with his labor. This informs us something significant. Even ancient scribes acknowledged these numbers as unusual, yet they safeguarded them with the same careful precision given to historically confirmable lineages. The 8 pre-flood kings offer us a timeline that defies every rule of human physiology and historical recording. Alulim governed Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalgar governed Eridu for 36,000 years. And Menluana governed Bad Tibira for 43,200 years. And Mengalana governed Bad Tibira for 28,800 years. Dumuzid governed Bad Tibira for 36,000 years. Ensipadzidana governed Larak for 28,800 years. And Mendurana governed Sipar for 21,000 years. Ubartutu governed Shurupak for 18,600 years. These numbers aren't arbitrary. They adhere to mathematical designs based on the Sumerian sexagesimal system, multiples of 3,600, which was inscribed as a large circle and signified Shar, a universal unit of measure linked to godly time cycles and celestial periods. Academics have suggested numerous explanations for these extraordinary term lengths, and it's valuable to review what scholarly agreement actually states and what it doesn't. The lineage theory proposes these names stand for whole lineages rather than single sovereigns. Alulim's 28,800 years might condense 8 centuries of governance by successive kings sharing the same throne designation, akin to how Pharaoh or Caesar became titles rather than individual names. This view has value. Royal designations in ancient Mesopotamia often signified position as much as personal identity. But it doesn't entirely solve the issue because the King List itself employs singular verb forms and presents these entities as distinct persons, not group units. The celestial theory observes that these numbers align remarkably well with heavenly cycles. The sum of 241,200 years for all pre-flood terms equals precisely 67 Shar units. Some academics contend the King List might encode astronomical insight, perhaps noting precession cycles, planetary alignments, or extended calendrical systems devised by Mesopotamian priest astronomers. Yet the texts never offer these numbers as emblematic. They catalog them beside geographically verifiable cities and lineages whose timelines match archaeological proof. The layout indicates political chronology, not celestial computation. The legendary time theory, which that disturbed scribe from Nippur appeared to support, suggests that these terms happened in a basically different temporal structure. Before the deluge, time itself functioned differently. The kings didn't survive impossibly long by human measures. They existed in an age where human measures didn't yet pertain. This theory regards the texts most earnestly as religious documents. It doesn't rationalize the numbers, but accepts them as precise depictions of an existence we no longer encounter. What academics generally concur on, these entities were not devised negligently. They appear uniformly across all primary King List manuscripts, covering 6 centuries of replication, from the Weld Blundell prism to the broken tablets from Larsa to the Sumerian dynastic list from the Babylonian era. Different scribes in different cities across different periods preserved identical timelines. Whatever these numbers signified, their significance was stable, authoritative, and viewed as crucial to the document's wholeness. What academics do not assert, that these represent real human lifespans quantifiable by modern criteria, or that we should discard them as mere overstatement. The meticulous preservation, the mathematical exactness, the theological uniformity all contend against regarding them as muddled mythology or scribal fault. Consider the names themselves. They bear meanings that suggest the universal roles these sovereigns allegedly represented. Alulim, possibly stag of the divine powers, linking the first king to primordial inventive forces. Enmenluana, lord of the divine crown of heaven, implying direct godly command administered on earth. Enmendurana, lord of the divine laws of heaven and earth. A designation that appears in later texts describing one who obtained secret insight directly from the deities and conveyed it to humanity before the deluge. These aren't standard throne designations. They're universal labels, positions within a broader godly harmony, functions needed for upholding existence during its susceptible early stage. The King List also safeguards another intriguing pattern. The terms don't reduce steadily, indicating a slow drop from legendary toward historical time. Instead, they vary. Al-Algar's 36,000 years, followed by Enmenluana's 43,200, then falling to Enmengalana's 28,800. The numbers alter based on city, on universal needs, on whatever elements determined how long each stabilization phase required. This irregular design contends against simple mythological exaggeration. If later scribes were merely making early kings appear more grand, we'd anticipate consistently huge numbers that slowly decrease toward the historical era. Instead, we observe variation that implies these figures serve some documentary aim we no longer completely grasp. The Sumerian King List from Lagash, found in 1900, includes a unique variation. It catalogues the pre-flood kings, but adds a single word after each term length. Mubi, literally, its year, not years plural, not in years, but its year, as if each term existed within a single prolonged temporal unit. A year that extended across ages, measured in a structure where our distinction between days, decades, and millennia held no significance. Language itself seems to struggle when depicting these sovereigns, as if Sumerian, advanced enough to record intricate agricultural logs, legal matters, and astronomical notes, lacked suitable terms for whatever these kings truly were. Post-deluge kings, by contrast, received term lengths that align with human feasibility. 1,200 years for the first Kish dynasty's early sovereigns, then dropping to 325, 265, 140 years, as the timeline nears periods we can verify archaeologically. By the time we reach Gilgamesh, a king who likely actually lived around 2700 BC, his term is listed as 126 years. Still amplified but recognizably within conceivable human bounds with legendary enhancement. The shift is sharp. Before the deluge, kings measuring time in Shar units, universal cycles, legendary epochs. After the deluge, kings measuring time in centuries then decades, gradually descending into the historical timeline where we can cross-reference the King List with archaeological proof and find correspondences. The deluge marks the border between two different types of being. And on the distant side of that border stand 8 entities whose terms ridicule every assumption we hold about human political chronicles. If these terms were not overstatements, not muddled recollections, not symbolic stand-ins, If the scribes safeguarded them because they recorded something genuine about early kingship's character, then what sort of entities could withstand them? The stele of Ur-Nammu, erected around 2100 BC and now held in fragments between the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, shows the king in an uncommon stance, not leading forces, not accepting tribute, not exhibiting martial strength. Instead, he stands before the deities in ceremonial position, grasping tools for shrine building, pouring offerings, upholding the godly household. The marking calls him Sipad, shepherd, and En lord. But these designations don't stress political might. They stress holy role, universal upkeep, the king as essential intermediary between heaven and earth. This is kingship as ceremonial representation, and it provides a glimpse into what the pre-flood sovereigns might truly have been. The Sumerian language preserved three main terms for ruler, and their differences matter deeply. En appears earliest in the textual record, emerging in the most archaic markings from Uruk and Ur. The word connects etymologically to the Sumerian notion of me, those fundamental edicts of existence that determined how everything operated. And En wasn't someone who demanded obedience through force or regulation. An En was someone who represented a specific godly ordinance, manifesting it in human shape, serving as the living expression of cosmic principle. The high priestess of Inanna at Uruk held the title En. The rulers of earliest Eridu bore the title En. It wasn't about governance as we comprehend it. It was about presence, the correct type of entity positioned accurately, upholding proper relation between godly design and earthly manifestation. Lugal, by contrast, arose later, probably during the early dynastic period around 2900 BC. It literally means great man or big man, emphasizing human traits, leadership, power, the capacity to organize and direct. Lugals assembled armies. Lugals conquered cities. Lugals negotiated pacts and protected territory. This is kingship as political position, and it emerges only after the deluge, after legendary time collapsed into historical time, after command became something humans could produce rather than something that had to descend from heaven. The third term, Ensi, designated a kind of governor or city ruler who administered on behalf of higher command, either a more potent king or directly for the city's patron deity, and an Ensi held power derivatively, channeling command that originated elsewhere. These linguistic differences map directly onto the King List's implicit timeline. The pre-flood sovereigns bear names incorporating Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Ensipadzidana, Enmendurana. They are presented as embodiments of godly principle, not as political overseers or military leaders. Post-deluge sovereigns begin adopting lugal titles. They wage wars. They construct fortifications. They compete for resources and land. Their command rests on very human abilities, organizing work, commanding allegiance, projecting force. The transition discloses something crucial. Kingship shifted from a universal role to a political office, from embodiment to administration, from presence to performance. Before the deluge, kings didn't govern in the modern sense. There's no proof of law codes, permanent armies, tax systems, or bureaucratic hierarchies during the periods the King List assigns to its earliest sovereigns. The Ubaid settlements display coordinated planning and shrine construction, but not coercive state mechanisms. So what did these sovereigns actually do? The ritual texts provide an answer. The En performed sacred marriage ceremonies, channeling fertility from the godly domain into earthly agriculture. The En consecrated shrines, activating holy space where deities and humans could interact properly. The En upheld the yearly cycle of festivals that renewed universal harmony, ensuring the basic patterns of existence remained intact. This was kingship as universal upkeep, presence rather than policy, embodiment rather than enforcement, ritual role rather than political administration. The Enuma Elish, though recorded much later, safeguards an older theological principle. Godly command doesn't direct from afar. It manifests through proper physical presence. Marduk doesn't govern the cosmos by issuing orders from distance. He constructs Babylon, establishes his shrine, positions himself at the world's center, and upholds harmony through ritual presence and periodic renewal of creation. The pre-flood kings, per this structure, weren't distant sovereigns issuing commands. They were living channels, physically representing the connection between godly intention and earthly existence, securing those two domains in proper relation through their very being. This explains why their terms are measured differently. They weren't counting years until death and succession. They were marking phases of universal firming, how long each specific configuration of godly harmony required active upkeep before existence could sustain itself without such intensive mediation. Consider Enmendurana, the seventh pre-flood king who governed Sippar for 21,000 years. Later Babylonian custom identifies him with Enmeduranki, founder of the Baru priesthood, the diviners who read omens, interpreted godly will, upheld communication between heaven and earth. Per these texts, the deities themselves taught Enmenduranki the secrets of divination, gave him the tablets of heaven, showed him how to read oil patterns and liver anomalies and astronomical signs. He didn't learn these arts from human instructors. He received them directly from the godly domain, then transmitted them to humanity before the deluge destroyed his line. He was a bridge, a translator, an entity who could exist in both universal and earthly structures simultaneously. This is not kingship as we know it. This is priesthood raised to universal role, or perhaps kingship before it separated from priesthood, before political command and religious mediation became distinct positions requiring different individuals. The archaeological record suggests this unity. The earliest shrines at Eridu show no division between ritual spaces and administrative centers. No distinction between sacred and secular building. Everything is integrated, implying that upholding godly harmony and organizing human society weren't yet separate activities. Only after the deluge do we see this separation arise. Shrines develop distinct architectural identity. Palaces emerge as separate institutions. Kings and priests become different persons with different roles. Command fragments into specialized positions. The king directs armies. The priest performs ceremonies. The scribe upholds records. The merchant manages commerce. But before that fragmentation, during the pre-flood period, kingship encompassed everything, because existence itself hadn't yet specialized into distinct spheres requiring different forms of expertise. The sovereigns functioned as living anchors, securing cosmic patterns in proper configuration through ritual presence and sacred performance. They didn't govern subjects. Subjects barely existed in the modern sense. They mediated between domains that were still learning how to remain separate, upheld borders that weren't yet self-sustaining, embodied godly harmony in a world that couldn't yet generate harmony from human social organization alone. This is why the King List doesn't describe their achievements or catalog their military victories or list their building projects. It simply records their presence, where they governed, for how long, under whose godly patronage. Their existence itself was their role. Later kings needed accomplishments to justify their command. The pre-flood sovereigns needed only to exist properly, positioned correctly, upholding the necessary mediation between heaven and earth. When Ur-Nammu carved that stele, depicting himself in ritual stance before the deities, he was reaching back toward this older grasp of kingship, attempting to present himself not as military leader or political overseer, but as sacred intermediary, universal maintainer, the living link between godly harmony and earthly being. But by his era around 2100 BC, this was already reminiscence. Kingship had become political, competitive, limited by human mortality and human ability. The universal role had collapsed into historical office. If these pre-flood kings embodied godly harmony itself, rather than merely overseeing it, if they secured existence stable through their very presence rather than through policy and force, then what happened when that harmony failed? What catastrophe could eliminate entities whose role was universal upkeep rather than political governance? In 1946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar started excavating Tel Abu Sharain, the ruins of ancient Eridu, and found something that shouldn't have been feasible per conventional models of urban growth. 18 successive shrine structures built directly atop one another, spanning from about 5,400 BC to 4,000 BC. Not scattered sanctuaries appearing slowly as population increased. Not experimental architecture developing toward standardized forms, but sophisticated shrines adhering to an established plan from the very start, rebuilt in the same alignment, upholding the same sacred geometry across 14 centuries. The earliest structure, Temple 18, already displays advanced architectural knowledge, buttress walls, offering platforms, careful spatial organization separating ritual zones from storage. This wasn't humanity's initial try at monumental building. This was execution of a template that already existed, as if someone knew what a shrine should resemble before anyone had constructed one. The King List names Eridu as the first city to receive kingship when it descended from heaven. Archaeological proof confirms Eridu as among the oldest permanent settlements in southern Mesopotamia. The match between textual assertion and physical proof is disturbing. Not because it proves the text literally accurate, but because it implies the Sumerians safeguarded precise memory of their city's relative antiquity across thousands of years. Eridu belonged to Enki, god of the subterranean Sweetwater Ocean, keeper of the Mi, source of wisdom and creative magic. His shrine, the Absu, literally House of the Absu, the structure that linked surface existence to the primordial waters beneath, the point where godly potential could shift into terrestrial form. The city wasn't constructed because humans needed a settlement. Per Sumerian theology, it existed because the cosmos required a specific node, a particular spot where heaven and earth could interact properly. Humans inhabited the city, but they didn't establish it. Bad Tabira, where 3 pre-flood kings governed for a combined 108,000 years, has proven harder to identify archaeologically. The name means fortress of the metal workers, and later texts link it with metal craft and godly smithing. It belonged to Dumuzi, the shepherd god, whose mythology focuses on fertility, death, and seasonal renewal. If Eridu represented wisdom and cosmic waters, Bad Tabira represented transformation, raw materials becoming tools, natural forces becoming useful forms, potential becoming actualized. The city embodied a different facet of godly harmony, the principle that existence requires shaping, that creation continues through conscious labor. The King List's placement of 3 successive sovereigns in Bad Tabira implies this transformative phase required prolonged attention, that forming existence into stable patterns took longer than initial foundation. Larak receives only one king in the pre-flood sequence, Ensipa-Zidana, who governed for 28,800 years. The city's location remains archaeologically unidentified, though texts place it in southern Mesopotamia near the marshlands. It belonged to Pabalsag, a warrior deity associated with plague and healing, 2 sides of the same cosmic principle, the power that both disrupts and restores harmony. That Larak receives only a single king suggests a brief but vital phase, perhaps representing the moment when cosmic harmony learned to defend itself, when existence developed the capacity to resist collapse back into undifferentiated chaos. Sipar, ruled by Enmendarana for 21,000 years, sat in northern Babylonia and belonged to Utu, the sun god, source of light, justice, and revealed truth. Sipar's shrines became renowned as centers of learning and divination. Later custom remembered Sipar as the place where the deities taught humans to read omens, to interpret godly will, to understand the patterns inscribed into existence itself. And Enmendarana, the king who supposedly received godly knowledge directly from the deities, governed the city of revelation and learning. Function matched location. The universal role aligned with geographical identity. Shuruppak, the 5th and final pre-flood city, belonged to Sud, later identified with Ninhursag, goddess of grain and sustenance. The last pre-flood king, Ubartutu, governed there for 18,600 years. Archaeological excavations at Tel Farah, ancient Shurupak, revealed something remarkable. A thick flood layer dating to approximately 2900 BC, sitting between Ubaid period remains and early dynastic settlements. The layer interrupts the archaeological sequence precisely where the King List places its flood. This doesn't prove the biblical or Sumerian flood myths literally true, but it shows that the cities the King List names as pre-flood actually were ancient, actually did experience catastrophic flooding, and actually did preserve memory of disruption severe enough to mark the transition between epochs. The 5 cities form a geographical pattern, spreading from Eridu in the far south northward through Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. The King List isn't randomly naming ancient settlements. It's documenting the expansion of sacred geography, mapping how godly harmony extended across the landscape, positioning nodes where heaven and earth could interact properly. Each city had distinct identity, distinct function, distinct patron deity. They weren't competing for resources or territory. They were collaborating in universal upkeep, each fulfilling a necessary role in securing existence stable during its susceptible early phase. Later Mesopotamian cities developed through very different processes. Uruk grew powerful through military expansion and trade dominance. Ur accumulated wealth through maritime commerce. Lagash and Umma fought bitter wars over irrigation rights and agricultural territory. These cities competed, conquered, rose and fell through recognizably human processes. But the pre-flood cities existed before competition, before warfare, before the mechanisms of political rivalry had emerged. They were positioned, not built, founded by godly intention, not human ambition. Their identities predetermined by cosmic function rather than discovered through trial and error. The King List never describes these cities being founded. It simply states where kingship was located during each term, as if the cities already existed when kingship descended, already waited with proper shrines and sacred spaces prepared, already knew their roles in the larger pattern. This reverses our understanding of urban origins. We imagine humans gathering into larger settlements out of necessity, agricultural surplus allowing population concentration, trade routes encouraging permanent markets, defensive needs promoting fortification, cities emerging from human needs and human ingenuity. The Sumerians documented the opposite. Cities positioned first according to cosmic requirements, then populated by humans who inherited already established sacred geography, already determined functions, already consecrated spaces. The pre-flood kings weren't city founders. They were city stewards, upholding what had been divinely established, administering locations that served cosmic purposes, securing sacred geography and proper configuration while existence stabilized. When Eridu's shrine sequence shows 14 centuries of continuous reconstruction following an established pattern, it's not showing human architectural tradition gradually evolving. It's showing something being upheld, preserved, protected across generations. A sacred template that couldn't be altered because it encoded essential cosmic function. Later kings built new shrines to display their power and piety. They innovated architecturally, competed for the most impressive monuments, used construction projects to legitimize their reigns. Building became political. But the pre-flood shrines weren't political statements. They were cosmic infrastructure, necessary nodes where godly harmony could anchor into terrestrial existence. Altering them would be like changing the fundamental constants of physics. Not impossible, perhaps, but guaranteed to destabilize everything that depended on their precise configuration. The 5 cities formed a network, a system of sacred geography that together upheld the boundary between heaven and earth, channeled godly harmony into physical form, secured existence stable while it learned to sustain itself. And per the texts, this entire network, every city, every shrine, every carefully upheld sacred site, was swept away when the deluge came. Not destroyed by invading armies or abandoned due to climate change, or gradually declining through natural processes, erased suddenly, catastrophically, by waters that ended the pre-flood world entirely. If these cities were divine installations rather than human experiments, if they served cosmic functions rather than political purposes, if they formed an integrated system upholding existence during its susceptible phase, what catastrophe could be severe enough to erase their first sovereigns and collapse the entire framework? The Weld-Blundell Prism, after documenting 8 kings across 5 cities ruling for a combined 241,200 years, delivers one of the most crushing transitions in ancient literature. Then the flood swept over. 5 words in English, 4 signs in Sumerian. No theological explanation, no moral judgment, no warning that divine patience had been exhausted or humanity had failed some cosmic test. Just a blunt statement of catastrophic fact, positioned like a geological boundary layer between 2 fundamentally different epochs. After those 5 words, everything changes. The text continues. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Notice what's absent. Any explanation of where the pre-flood kings went, what happened to the 5 sacred cities, why the carefully upheld cosmic harmony suddenly required complete reset. The text doesn't pause to process the loss. It simply documents the transition. Flood happened. Kingship resumed, but now in a different city under different conditions. This textual silence is more disturbing than any elaborate flood narrative could be. The Eridu Genesis, that broken tablet excavated from Nippur, preserves more context. Per its account, the deities decided to send the deluge, not because humanity had sinned, but because human noise had grown too loud, disturbing divine rest. The god Enlil, keeper of cosmic harmony and separator of heaven and earth, determined that the proliferation of human settlements had destabilized the carefully upheld boundary between divine and mortal domains. The deluge wasn't punishment. It was correction, a violent reimposition of proper cosmic structure, a forced reset of existence that had begun drifting from its intended configuration. But here's what matters. The flood texts consistently describe the catastrophe as targeting cities, not individuals. The waters swept over Shuruppak, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, not because these cities contained wicked people, but because they represented the pre-flood order itself, the framework that connected heaven and earth through sacred geography and cosmic kingship. Destroying the cities meant destroying the system they formed, collapsing the network of sacred nodes that had upheld existence during its vulnerable phase. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BC but preserving much older material, describes the flood's onset with geological precision. The dikes broke. The storm gods released the rains. The subterranean waters erupted upward, mixing fresh water from below with salt water from above, dissolving the fundamental distinction between Absu and sea, collapsing the carefully separated cosmic layers back into primordial unity. For 7 days and 7 nights, per the text, existence itself reverted to pre-creation conditions. The separation of heaven and earth, Enlil's foundational act that made terrestrial being possible, temporarily failed. The boundaries collapsed. The cosmos remembered what it had been before creation began. This wasn't a large flood. This was the end of the world, followed by its reformation. The King List studied restraint in describing this catastrophe. Just 5 words, no elaboration, somehow conveys the event's magnitude more effectively than any detailed narrative. Because what language could adequately describe the collapse of cosmic harmony? What words exist for the end of legendary time, the forced closure of the permeable boundary between divine and mortal domains? Then the flood swept over. Everything before that line existed in one order of existence. Everything after exists in another. The archaeological proof, interestingly, suggests multiple severe flooding events in southern Mesopotamia during the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods, roughly 4,000 to 3,000 BC. Excavations at Ur revealed a flood layer 11 feet thick. Shuruppak showed clear disruption between Ubaid and early dynastic settlements. Kish displayed evidence of catastrophic water damage during the early dynastic period. These weren't the same flood. They weren't simultaneous, but they demonstrate that the cities the king List names as pre-flood actually did experience devastating water catastrophes that interrupted their archaeological sequences. The Sumerians, living in the flat alluvial plains between two great rivers, knew flooding intimately. Annual inundations brought both fertility and danger. The entire civilization existed in constant negotiation with water, building irrigation systems, maintaining dikes, calculating flood seasons, preparing for the river's unpredictable violence. But the flood the King List describes wasn't seasonal overflow or irrigation failure. It was comprehensive erasure. Waters that swept over the entire known world, eliminated every pre-flood city simultaneously, and ended an epoch that had lasted longer than all of subsequent human history. What could cause such catastrophe? The texts offer no natural explanation, because they didn't understand it as a natural event. This was cosmic mechanics, not weather. The deities deliberately collapsed the pre-flood order because that order had served its purpose and needed replacement with something more permanent, more separated, more purely terrestrial. The deluge forced existence into its final configuration. Before, heaven and earth permeable to each other, divine and mortal domains overlapping, cosmic time and human time operating simultaneously. After, permanent separation, fixed boundaries, legendary time collapsed into historical chronology. The pre-flood kings, whose function was mediating between domains that were still learning to remain distinct, became obsolete the moment the deluge forced those domains into permanent separation. You don't need transitional authorities once the transition is complete. You don't need entities capable of existing in both cosmic and terrestrial structures once those structures are permanently divided. The King List preserves one other crucial detail. Kingship itself survived the deluge, but it had to descend from heaven again. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven. The second descent wasn't the same as the first. Kingship returned, but transformed, stripped of its cosmic role, no longer capable of mediating between divine and terrestrial harmony, reduced to purely human administration. The institution survived. Its nature didn't. Later Mesopotamian custom remembered one pre-flood survivor, Ziusudra in Sumerian sources, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The deities warned him of the coming deluge, instructed him to build a boat, saved a remnant of humanity and animal life. But notice who didn't survive, the pre-flood kings, Alulim, who governed for 28,800 years, and Mendurana, who received divine knowledge directly from the deities, Ubartutu, the last pre-flood ruler. None of them appear in post-deluge narratives. None are remembered as survivors who bridged the old world and new. They vanished completely, as if the deluge didn't just kill them, but erased the very category of being they represented. After the waters receded, entities capable of enduring 28,800-year terms simply ceased to exist. The cosmic conditions that allowed such figures were permanently closed. The flood texts describe Ziusudra receiving immortality after the catastrophe, taken by the deities to dwell at the mouth of the rivers in a distant paradise, removed from normal human being. This detail is telling. The only human who survived the deluge couldn't remain fully human afterward. He had to be transformed, removed, positioned outside normal existence, as if surviving the transition between cosmic epochs required becoming something other than what you were. The pre-flood kings, by contrast, simply ended. The texts don't describe their deaths or their transformation or their ascension to divine status. They were present before the deluge. They were absent after. The line between their existence and their disappearance is exactly 5 words wide. Then the flood swept over. If the deluge erased more than cities, more than populations, More than physical geography, if it permanently closed the permeable boundary between heaven and earth, ended legendary time, and collapsed the cosmic structure that allowed kingship to function as divine mediation. What did it permanently change about kingship itself? The King List resumes after the deluge with a sentence that mirrors its opening. But the difference is everything. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, not Eridu, not any of the 5 pre-flood cities. Kingship relocated to Kish, a city in northern Babylonia with no previous mention in the pre-flood sequence, no established sacred geography, no shrine traditions stretching back millennia. The cosmic network had been erased. Kingship was starting over, but under profoundly different conditions. The first post-deluge ruler is listed as Ga-ur, who governed Kish for 1,200 years. The second, Gulanidaba Anapad, governed for 960 years. By the 23rd king of Kish, term lengths have dropped to 420 years, then 300, then 140. Still exaggerated by modern standards, still impossibly long by human biology, but nothing remotely approaching the 28,800 and 43,200-year terms of the pre-flood period. The scale has collapsed by orders of magnitude. Something fundamental changed in how kingship operated, how command functioned, how sovereigns related to time itself. The trajectory continues downward across successive lineages. The first dynasty of Uruk lists Meskiangasha ruling for 324 years, followed by his son Enmerkar at 420 years. By the time we reach Gilgamesh, 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty, probably a historical figure who lived around 2700 BC, his term is listed as 126 years, still inflated, but approaching conceivable human lifespan with mythological enhancement. We've moved from cosmic time to legendary time to something barely distinguishable from historical chronology. The King List begins documenting features entirely absent from the pre-flood period. Dynastic succession, father-son transitions, competing cities claiming kingship simultaneously. The text notes when kingship was defeated and transferred to another city through military conquest. It records kings overthrown, dynasties ending, power shifting through warfare rather than cosmic reorganization. This is kingship as political office, competitive, unstable, violent command that must be seized and defended rather than simply embodied and upheld. The contrast is sharp. Before the deluge, 8 kings across 5 cities in careful sequence, each ruling until cosmic conditions permitted transition to the next phase. No warfare, no succession crises, no competing claims. After the deluge, 23 kings in Kish alone, followed by rival dynasties in Uruk, Ur, Awan, and Hamazi, each fighting for supremacy. Each dynasty eventually defeated and replaced. Kingship survived, but it survived diminished, contested, mortal. The theological language persists. Kingship still descended from heaven after the deluge, still came from divine domain rather than human invention. Later kings still claimed to rule by divine mandate, still performed sacred rituals, still positioned themselves as mediators between deities and humanity. But the nature of that mediation had fundamentally changed. Post-deluge kings ruled under the deities, not as extensions of divine harmony. They received command from above, but exercised it in purely terrestrial terms, commanding armies, building fortifications, managing irrigation systems, collecting tribute. The cosmic role had collapsed into political administration. Consider what's absent from post-deluge royal inscriptions compared to pre-flood theology. No claims about upholding the separation of heaven and earth. No descriptions of securing existence stable. No language suggesting the king's very existence performed necessary cosmic work. Instead, military victories, canal construction, shrine renovations, tribute collection, accomplishments that prove competence, not embodiment that upholds harmony. Kings now needed to justify their command through visible achievement, because their existence itself no longer constituted cosmic upkeep. The archaeological record mirrors this transition. Early dynastic period cities show fortification walls, weapons arsenals, administrative archives documenting warfare and diplomacy, the material culture of competition, of defensive architecture, of power that must be actively defended. Nothing comparable appears in Ubaid period settlements. The pre-flood cities show sophisticated planning but no fortifications, shrines but no palaces, sacred architecture but no military infrastructure. Post-deluge kingship required coercive apparatus because it no longer rested on cosmic necessity. It had become a human institution, subject to human challenges, vulnerable to human limitations, and the most devastating human limitation: death. The king list begins recording not just term lengths, but succession. This king followed by that king, father succeeded by son, dynasties ending when royal lines failed. Mortality enters political chronology. Command becomes hereditary, transferred through bloodlines rather than cosmic designation. The pre-flood sovereigns never die in the text. They simply rule for their appointed spans until kingship transfers to the next city. No succession narratives, no deaths recorded, no graves mentioned. They exist in legendary time where endings don't function like historical deaths. Post-deluge kings die constantly. The text tracks their mortality, records their successors, documents the instability that death introduces into political structures. Kingdoms fragment when strong kings die. Rival claimants emerge. Dynasties collapse. Kingship had become fragile, dependent on individual capability, vulnerable to mortality, requiring constant renewal and defense. The institution that once descended complete from heaven now struggled to maintain itself across a single human lifetime. If kingship survived the deluge but lost its cosmic role, if command persisted but became competitive and mortal, if the institution remained but its nature transformed completely, what was lost forever in that transition? What capacity, what knowledge, what connection to existence's foundations vanished when the pre-flood order drowned? The law code of Ur-Nammu, carved around 2100 BC, opens with a preamble that reveals everything about what kingship had become. After An and Enlil had turned over the kingship to Nana, at that time I, Ur-Nammu, the mighty warrior, king of Ur, king of Sumer and Akkad, by the might of Nana, lord of the city, and in accordance with the true word of Utu, established equity in the land. Notice the careful positioning. The deities turned over kingship, transferred it like property, delegated it like a task. Ur-Nammu doesn't embody divine harmony. He receives authorization from above, then exercises human judgment within that framework. He must establish equity. It doesn't flow automatically from his existence. He must create law codes because justice no longer upholds itself through cosmic structure. He must use might, military force, because command no longer rests on sacred presence alone. This is kingship after its fall from cosmic role into political necessity. The law code itself, the earliest known legal text, emerges precisely because kingship can no longer uphold harmony through embodiment. Written rules become necessary when command stops being self-evident, when disputes can't be resolved by reference to cosmic patterns, when humans must explicitly negotiate what divine harmony once simply imposed. Pre-flood sovereigns needed no law codes. They were the law, living expressions of divine ordinance, physical manifestations of cosmic principle. Post-deluge kings must write laws, enforce them through bureaucracy and military power, constantly defend their interpretations against challenges. The shift from embodied command to legislated command marks the completion of kingship's humanization. By the time Hammurabi carved his famous code around 1750 BC, the transformation was complete. His prologue describes the deities choosing him, granting him command, commissioning him to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land. Then follows 282 specific laws covering everything from property disputes to assault penalties to professional malpractice. Divine mandate, reduced to legal technicality. Cosmic harmony translated into bureaucratic specification. The infinite complexity of existence compressed into numbered paragraphs that humans could debate, interpret, and inevitably find insufficient. This is what kingship became when divinity withdrew. An endless project of trying to recreate through human effort what once existed as given cosmic structure. The archaeological proof tracks this transformation materially. Early dynastic palaces show massive administrative quarters, room after room of clay tablets documenting grain receipts, labor assignments, tribute payments, diplomatic correspondence. The apparatus of human governance grows massive, trying to manage complexity that cosmic kingship once handled through simple presence. Bureaucracy proliferates when command becomes administrative rather than existential. You need accountants when resources must be tracked rather than flowing naturally from divine harmony. You need standing armies when power must be projected rather than embodied. You need diplomats when relationships between cities become competitive rather than cooperative. The pre-flood period required none of this machinery. 5 cities functioning in sacred network, each fulfilling its cosmic role. Kingship transferred smoothly across 241,200 years without warfare, without competition, without the elaborate apparatus of control. Post-deluge history is an unbroken chronicle of conflict. City against city, dynasty against dynasty, king against king. The Sumerian King List reads like a military casualty report once it crosses the deluge boundary. Kingdoms defeated, dynasties overthrown, cities sacked and burned. Lugalzagesi of Umma conquered 50 cities. Sargon of Akkad overthrew Lugalzagesi and built the first empire. Naram Sin declared himself divine, trying desperately to reclaim what the pre-flood sovereigns possessed naturally. The Gutians invaded and destroyed Akkadian power. Ur-Nammu rebuilt order, then died in battle. His son Shulgi ruled 50 years through constant military campaigning. Violence becomes the medium of political transition because command no longer transfers cosmically. Power must be seized, defended, maintained through perpetual struggle. This is progress per conventional historical narrative. Humans taking control of their own destiny, developing sophisticated political systems, building civilizations through ingenuity and effort. We celebrate the law codes, the administrative innovations, the monumental architecture as evidence of advancing complexity and capability. But the Sumerian King List documents this progress as catastrophic decline, from cosmic permanence to political chaos, from divine harmony to human struggle, from 28,800-year terms maintained effortlessly to decades-long rules preserved only through constant warfare. History, as we recognize it, begins exactly where divinity withdraws. The moment kingship stops being cosmic role and becomes human office, we enter historical time. Measured, recorded, progressing through cause and effect toward an unknown future. Before that moment, there was no history in our sense, just eternal upkeep of divine harmony, existence held stable by proper presence, time measured in cosmic phases rather than political transitions. The pre-flood period wasn't prehistory, the darkness before written records began. It was prehistorical existence, before the category of historical time applied, existence operating under rules we no longer experience. When the deluge forced kingship to become human, it simultaneously created history as the record of humanity's struggle to manage power. It wasn't originally meant to originate. If human history begins with diminished kingship, if all our progress represents desperate attempts to recreate through effort what once existed as cosmic gift, if civilization itself is just elaborate compensation for lost divine connection, what does that say about progress itself? Are we advancing towards something better, or still falling from something we can barely remember? In 1889, Hermann Hilprecht discovered a small clay tablet at Nippur that had been broken and repaired in antiquity. The repair itself dated to around 1800 BC. Someone 3,800 years ago considered this particular King List copy valuable enough to mend rather than simply creating a new one. The tablet contained the same impossible chronology, the same 8 pre-flood sovereigns, the same 5-word transition marking the deluge. But the ancient repair reveals something profound. Even millennia after the pre-flood period supposedly ended, scribes treated these records as irreplaceable, as preserving knowledge too important to lose. They weren't copying mythology for entertainment. They were upholding memory of something that actually shaped their understanding of existence. A different order of being that their civilization remembered as foundational, even if it no longer operated in their present world. This brings us back to where we began. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. We've examined what the texts actually say. We've traced kingship from cosmic role to political office, from embodied command to administered power, from 28,800-year terms to decades-long struggles. We've watched divinity withdraw and history begin. Now we can address what this story actually preserves. Not ancient astronauts conducting genetic experiments, not advanced civilizations with lost technologies, not literal deities descending in spacecraft or intervening directly in human affairs. Instead, memory of a fundamentally different relationship between command and existence, between divine and terrestrial domains, between cosmic harmony and human society. The Sumerians, looking back at their civilization's origins, remembered, or believed they remembered, a time when political power wasn't generated by human social organization, but descended from a larger cosmic structure. When cities existed as nodes in divine architecture, rather than as human settlements. When sovereigns upheld existence itself, rather than merely overseeing populations. Whether this memory reflects actual historical conditions or represents sophisticated theological interpretation of their own origins matters less than what the memory reveals about how they understood power, legitimacy, and humanity's place in cosmic harmony. They documented a fall, not humanity's moral fall requiring redemption, but kingship's structural fall from cosmic role into human limitation. Command survived but diminished. Power persisted but became fragile, contested, violent. The pre-flood sovereigns in this structure weren't deities. They weren't fully human either. They occupied a liminal category, entities suited to existence's transitional phase, capable of functioning in legendary time while historical time hadn't yet properly begun, embodying divine harmony while that harmony was still learning to uphold itself independently of direct cosmic oversight. When the deluge closed that transitional epoch, entities of that type ceased to exist, not because they died, though the physical bodies they inhabited certainly perished, but because the cosmic conditions that allowed such beings had permanently ended. Kingship returned, but only in diminished form, exercised by sovereigns operating entirely within human limitations. The institution became a relic, preserved from an earlier order, but stripped of its original role, maintained through human effort rather than cosmic necessity. We inherit this relic. Every political system, monarchy, democracy, theocracy, dictatorship, descends from that moment when command stopped being divine gift and became human construction. We've spent all of subsequent history trying to solve the problem of legitimate governance, building ever more elaborate systems to answer a question that didn't exist before the deluge. Who deserves to rule, and why? The pre-flood world didn't ask that question, because command descended complete from heaven, positioned in specific cities, embodied by specific entities suited to cosmic upkeep. Legitimacy was cosmological, not political. Power flowed from the structure of existence itself. After the deluge, that structure collapsed. Humans inherited political command without the cosmic structure that had originally generated it. We've been improvising ever since, writing law codes, developing bureaucracies, building institutions, always trying to create through human ingenuity what once existed as given cosmic harmony. The Sumerian King List documents this transition with remarkable honesty. It doesn't pretend the fall didn't happen. It doesn't claim human kings possess the same command as their pre-flood predecessors. It simply records the break, preserves the memory of what was lost, and continues documenting what came after. History in this understanding begins not with humanity's rise to civilization, but with kingship's fall from cosmic role. Everything we celebrate as progress, written law, complex administration, monumental architecture, sophisticated political systems, represents compensation for lost connection to divine harmony. We're not advancing toward recovered cosmic harmony. We're managing as well as humans can manage power that was never meant to originate with us in the first place. This isn't pessimistic. It's simply honest about our condition. We inherited a diminished institution and made the best of it. We developed remarkable systems, created sophisticated civilizations, built cultures of extraordinary complexity. But we did so knowing, at some deep level preserved in our oldest texts, that we're working with fragments of something that once functioned more completely. The pre-flood sovereigns are gone. The cosmic kingship they embodied is gone. The 5 sacred cities are gone. The 241,200 years of stable divine harmony are gone. What remains is us, humans, governing ourselves as best we can, building civilizations through effort rather than embodying them through presence, measuring time in decades rather than epochs, struggling with mortality and limitation and the endless instability of power that must be maintained rather than simply existing. Human history may not begin with the rise of kings, but with their fall from something greater. And if the first rulers were not fully human, if kingship itself wasn't originally ours, if political command descends from cosmic structures we no longer experience, what else about our beginnings have we misunderstood? Shoot.